I'm going to briefly talk about tabs and indentation in code because this is a controversial subject, but I really don't think that it needs to be, and I think that a lot of the debate surrounding it is pointless and usually self-defeating because I notice that it often seems to stem from a lack of understanding of the purposes that tab characters, as opposed to just indentation itself, are supposed to accomplish in code and really any text document. So I'm going to need to start out by clarifying that since a lot of people don't seem to understand this, tabs are not meant for alignment. They fundamentally cannot be used for alignment because alignment requires enforcing a consistent width, and tab characters cannot do this because tab width is dependent upon a width specified by the end user or whatever system they're using. If it has a predefined tab width, but you can't enforce it. You can't enforce it without using spaces, and then just using a consistent space interval for alignment throughout whatever document it is you're working in. And a lot of editors have functionality for inserting spaces when tabbing according to the width set by the user. But I'm going to explain why this is not useful for code indentation and why people should. First of all, stop trying to use spaces for indentation in their code, and second of all, stop arguing about it and about tab width, because when you use tabs, the width becomes irrelevant. If you're using tabs the way they're meant to be used, which in most languages, in most layouts for code, with some exceptions like assembly code, which I'll explain later, tab width becomes irrelevant because tabs are only meant to be used for indentation blocks and nothing else. So if you use them properly, tab width ultimately just becomes irrelevant, and there's no need to argue over it to begin with. You can debate which tab width, I guess, is visually the ideal one, because in different scenarios, different tab widths will create differing levels of clarity, and this comes down to both. This comes down to both observable clarity and also personal taste, personal competence in reading. But when it comes to the use of tabs in code for indentation and alignment, none of this really is down to opinion. Tabs, as I mentioned previously, fundamentally cannot be used for alignment, and so there's really just no argument to be had here. Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate a little bit. I'm going to start out writing a standard hello world in C. So you can see the editor will automatically indent, and when I move back and forth, it's moving over an inserted tab character in the text file. So if you were to read this as a formatted string, say in a hex editor, if you viewed just the raw text characters, you would see you'd see the opening bracket and then a tab character, and then if I were to indent twice, another tab character, then another tab character. So this would read as bracket, tab character, printf, hello world, and then return after another tab character preceded by a new line here, a new line here as well. I think you get the idea. So if I were to indent twice here, there would be 2 tab characters, 3 tab characters. You know how it works by now, I'm sure. So some people seem insistent on using spaces for indentation for some reason or another, and I think this is ridiculous, and a lot of people will defer to arguments about or assertions of personal taste. I like doing it this way, and you should simply respect the way I work, but I think this is just stupid because, as you can see here, if I indent using spaces, I have it set to 4 spaces for tab size, and tabs to spaces is on. I indent once, it inserts. Oh, hang on. There we go, it should work now. Okay. So it'll insert 4 spaces. Of course, when I backspace, it'll delete all 4 spaces, but that's just editor functionality because it reads that there's just a clean tab consisting of spaces. But that's irrelevant right now. So you can see when I move, it's moving over 4 spaces that are used for indentation. This is indentation, not level 1. I indent twice. This is indentation level 2, indentation level 3, etc. So indentations are just supposed to be increments of visual space to distinguish blocks of code, layers of code, this nesting. You know what I mean by this. So I don't know why some people try to insist on using spaces. I guess because they prefer a particular tab width and they believe that doing this is the best way to keep it consistent. But if you write code well, this just becomes really irrelevant. You can see here, if I change the tab size to, say, 8, this doesn't change here. Say I start writing my code on top of code that somebody else wrote here. I indent once, go to insert a variable or whatever. This is equivalent to having indented twice in the old code, meaning I have to adhere to, meaning I have to change things around to adhere to whatever standard was put in place by the other person working on this. And this is unnecessary because tabs are supposed to be consistent increments of a set of characters just to distinguish blocks of code, and they're not really supposed to be used for anything else. So there's just no point in doing this. Rust, for some reason or another, has a native enforcement of using spaces for tabbing and 4 spaces as the tab width, and this is largely enforced through the standard tool chain because it comes with a linter, a format tool that will complain if you deviate from this standard style. And I have to ask, what is even the point of doing this? Because all it does is just create endless arguments about preference over tab sizes where they don't need to be. Particular tab sizes get enforced in places where they really don't need to be. It becomes incredibly difficult to change in places where you need to use different tab sizes. So you can see here, if I switch back to using actual tab characters for tabbing, then when I go to indent, it'll work normally. So indentation level 1, indentation level 2, indentation level 3. These are all respectively using the number of, they're using a number of tab characters respective to their level. So this is 3 tab characters because it's indented 3 times. If I change the tab size to 4 or 2, whichever works best, either for me or in the situation that I'm currently in, this remains consistent, and this is the ideal way to do things. This isn't even just my opinion, this is just how it works best, and this is how people should be writing their code, because all it does is just avoid problems, and it lets the user determine what their ideal tab width is. So say I prefer writing with 4 spaces for tabs visually. I can just do this easily, regardless of whoever's code I'm working with, as long as they actually adhere to the principles that allow for this. And I'm going to explain those. Some people try to use tabs for alignment where they shouldn't be doing this. So say I'm declaring variables char c. Usually you would just separate the type from the name with a space. Some people, however, decide that they want to align these because it's visually uncomfortable or something. I can understand this, but they tab it. So they'll separate the type from the character with a tab, but then you see that this doesn't line up with 4 spaces as the tab width. So for int, I would need to separate it using 2, char, separate it using 1. Now, this might look fine in the moment, but then the second that I change the tab width, everything just breaks. And so this is why tabs have no business being used for alignment in really anywhere. There are scenarios in which alignment is fairly important, like say you're writing assembly code. You can see that the layout is column based if you're not just separating the operands from the instruction with a single space, because that just kind of looks bad and it makes more sense to sort things into columns, first column being the instruction, second column being the operands, and then also sometimes having another column over here for comments, that you want to align. So say I'm using 8 spaces as the tab width currently, and I'm sorting things this way. I change it to 4 and everything breaks once again. So this is a scenario in which you need to consistently sort these things into columns through alignment, and so this is where it's important to use spaces for alignments, so that way it remains consistent across environments. And of course there are still going to be people who complain about whatever layout it is you're using. If you share your code, they might say that they prefer 4 spaces over 8 for aligning assembly code like this. With 68K assembly, which is what this is, I think it's important to use 8 spaces for alignment, because the longest instructions fit within 7 spaces, as you can see here. And so if you use 8 for alignment, then everything is guaranteed to line up just like this, unless you write a custom macro, which is longer than 7 characters that you need to use arguments for. Then everything will break. But I guess just keep that in mind and don't write macros with names like that. I don't know, but that's kind of irrelevant right now. So I guess if you absolutely need to align variable names, I would just use spaces if absolutely necessary, because as you can see here, if I change the tab width, at the very least the alignment remains consistent. So if you feel the need to keep the alignment to the width of the longest type name plus 1 for the space, and align everything to this as is seen here, then you can do that, as long as you're not using tabs, because tabs will just break the consistency. This at the very least will remain consistent. And so I should recap a bit, since I've gone over pretty much everything I need to, but I've also gone on many tangents. So tabs are only to be used for indentation, not alignment. And indentation is only to be how do I best express this? Level times width. Width is defined by the user. All that indentation really needs to be is just a quantity of... How do I put it? Okay, so all that it needs to be is just a quantity of increments, the increments being whatever the width is. The width is defined by the user. By nature, this is all indentation is supposed to be. Alright, that's the function that it's supposed to serve in code. There's no... there are no opinions here. This is how it's simply supposed to work. If you need to enforce a consistent width for tab characters for your code, for the end user to use in order to keep things aligned, then you're simply doing it wrong. And you're using tabs for things they're not supposed to be used for, or if you're using spaces to try to enforce a width for indentation, you're using alignment for something that it's inherently not supposed to be for, or alignment simply doesn't apply to indentation. So if you follow these principles, what else do I mention here? Alignment is to be done by spaces. Applies in certain text layout formats. C assembly, in which you need to use columns. Columns are not needed in most conventional languages using indentation. Now, also, you should see here what I've done is use indentation levels in order to nest bullet points. And I have also used spaces for alignment in order to wrap or continue these nested bullet points. And if I change the tab size from whatever it is currently, I'm going to assume it's just 4. Yeah, that looks correct. This will remain consistent because of the use of spaces for micromanaging alignment wherever it's needed on top of indentation. So this should serve as another demonstration of how tabs versus spaces are supposed to properly be used in code and other standard basic text. I should also point out that if you're using a non-monospace font, then trying to align by spaces isn't really going to work out, but I'm going to assume that in most cases you are doing this when coding anyway, or when writing really basic documentation. If you're not, then good luck. I guess you're going to need to find something else. It doesn't really hurt to just wrap underneath the bullet point, I guess, because at the very least it's still following the bullet point's alignment or indentation. So I believe that covers everything. I want people to stop arguing about tab sizes. I want languages like Rust to stop setting these arbitrary standards and using spaces to enforce these standards, because standards for tab width are just completely irrelevant to code that uses indentation blocks. There's no need for it. People need to stop trying to enforce it. People need to stop arguing over it and start using indentation with tabs properly, and then this won't even be an issue anymore.